All right. So as you can see, I'm proposing that we continue with the ongoing lecture series this week. And I do recognize that there's a lot happening in the news in the world right now. The trials and travails, quite literally trials of our former president. The war in the Ukraine certainly appears to be heating up. Big changes at Fox News, both in terms of the legal settlement and in terms of its personnel. Elsewhere in the media environment, Joe Biden declaring that he will, in fact, seek reelection in 2024. I don't think that's a big surprise, but nevertheless, it means that the table is kind of set for the initial phases of the primary and perhaps into the general elections in next year. So there's a lot to talk about, but I do think, in a sense, what we're doing when we explore the political economy of the 21st century in the United States is we're at least getting a really important background to all of our domestic political issues. And so that's where I'm going to continue to focus today. One thing I took home as a souvenir from my trip to Washington, D.C. last weekend is a little trip to the National Gallery and an image of Pierre Monet's The Old Musician. And so I've changed my arts on the opening slide a little bit. We still have Diego Rivera's representation of what an economy of solidarity that values workers, in which diverse workers work together, might look like. But then I've got Manet, who I imagine many of you are familiar with as a mid 19th century French, I guess, proto-impressionist artist. And in particular, Manet was socially involved, and a lot of his art builds in social criticism. This is one of the more famous pieces in the sense that following a fire, there was a reworking of Paris in the middle of the 19th century. All the big boulevards people love were, in fact, a product of that era. And the upshot of this era, this effort at urban renewal, was to displace many of the poor people of Paris. And so this is meant to be a gathering of people who used to live in Paris, but who are now forced by the state into the countryside with no home, nothing to do. The musician who gives the painting its name staring out at us. The woman who, right, the woman and the man, at least they have some pretense to being a little bit perhaps better off. A top hat, some kind of shawl with fur on it, but she is literally marginalized, right? Halfway off the margin of the painting. And I think that this painting represents the disregard of a society for its more precarious and marginal members. And the juxtaposition again gets at the themes I'm trying to get at in this lecture series. We did better in the middle of the 20th century at building a more inclusive economy, and an economy that felt fairer, felt more just, but also felt more compatible not only with democratic values, but also with a polity in which the equality of citizens was actively respected. And so last week, I began talking with you about the New Deal and its limits. And that's where I'm going to continue today. I'm going to drill a little bit deeper on the New Deal to see what it did well, according to one of its most eminent defenders, but then also trying to get into what went wrong with the New Deal. And the idea is, if we want to have a quote renew deal, a 21st century New Deal, how can we both build on the strengths but also address the weaknesses of the New Deal as we try to build better policy for the 21st century to secure what I'm calling a democratic political economy for our present moment. The background to this, of course, is the staggering growth, the stunning growth of inequality in the United States over the last 40 years, during a period that critics refer to as the neoliberal period, the period in which we return to a late 19th, early 20th century approach to economic policy of allowing the free market, free reign over the production of goods, but also the distribution of income and wealth. And as you can see, rapid increase in inequality, a hollowing out of the middle class, rendering many people more vulnerable. I've been looking at Matthew Desmond's recent work, Poverty by America, and one of the things that Desmond points out is that if we put the poor in America, the officially poor, which is not a particularly generous indication of what poverty is, into a group and considered it a country, it would be a reasonably middle-sized European country, roughly the size of Belgium, the number of people who are poor in the richest country in the United States. And this is not just then impoverishing people, rendering them economically precarious, it's also producing tremendous status anxiety. Do I really belong in this society? Do people really care about me? And that is having extremely deleterious psychological and health effects, with this incredible spike in deaths of despair over the last 20 years, deaths by suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse. And the more long-term history of what we're dealing with, to put it in a perspective that goes back, instead of 40 or 50 years, 120 years, helps us to see that we are the product of two divergent trends, a trend to greater equality that began at the beginning of the 19th century and reached its high watermark in the middle of the 20th century, and then a trend to greater inequality again. So, coming apart, coming together, coming apart again. And that, I emphasize again, is relevant in part because many people in the middle class had their expectations set by this period of greater equality, the Great Compression, and just assumed that they would continue to be stably middle class and have a decent life in our society, and then were deeply dismayed by, in fact, the return to greater inequality. And also what the arc of the history here displays is that, in fact, public policy did work in the past to reduce inequality. Presumably it could work again in the future. And so that this represents not just a kind of fait accompli, natural force of an economy, but a policy choice. And of course, in a democracy, our fellow citizens are responsible for our policy choices. Wilma, it looks like you've got your hand up. Yeah, go ahead, please. You've got to unmute yourself. Go ahead. I think we can hear you if you talk. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the big reasons for our coming together as a nation in the middle of the 20th century was World War II. It wasn't just the economic policies. We were at war, so we were united on the home front. And the combination of the New Deal and the impact that had on ending segregation in the military and defense spending, the great migration of Blacks out of the South, it just had, and culminating in the GI Bill. So that impacted everything.
Wilma, I think you're spot on. And let me say just a little bit more about this very briefly. So if we do that history of the buildup to the New Deal, right? Mm-hmm. I think we maybe start with the progressives and the populists of the late 19th century, who are radically anti-rich, anti-monopoly, antitrust, and saying, right, you know, these guys are profiting on our backs. You then have World War I, You then have very quickly the New Gilded Age, followed by the Great Depression, and then those progressive and populist themes really ring true, right? Which is to say, these rich people don't care about the country. They've actually run the economy into a ditch while lining their own pockets, right? We can't trust them. We have to regulate them. We have to break them up and redistribute from them if we're talking about monopolies or the hyper wealthy.
Yeah, there are people who considered Franklin Roosevelt a traitor to his class.
Exactly.
But he's capitalism for another century.
And let us remember that FDR embraced that label. He liked that label, right? And that it's very different from the current moment we're in, where we've spent the last 40 years celebrating the very rich, celebrating the entrepreneurs.
That's right.
Where there's very little genuine class antagonism in our politics. I think, again, it's part of the vacuum that Trump filled in a very destructive way, but that the absence of a constructive channeling of resentment against the wealthy for their destructive behavior. So we've got progressives, populism, World War I, Great Depression. Let's not forget a communist revolution in Russia. Right, and the fear that put into the capitalist class to allow them, in a sense, to let FDR save capitalism from itself. Then World War II, then the GI Bill, then the Cold War, which also was unifying, and the fact that World War II had done so much damage to the economies of Europe and Asia that the United States was for a long time in an unrivaled position in terms of competitive advantage, economically speaking. Yes.
Just one more word, because currently socialism has become a curse word. Mm-hmm. It's become a bête noire in our society.
Yeah.
And I frankly consider myself a democratic social democrat.
Yes.
Well, I don't fit.
Yeah, and so in a couple weeks, I will be coming to you from Prague, where I'll be going to an academic conference to present a paper in which we're debating precisely this. And I have to say, I'm on the side that says, let's not call it socialism. I mean, so very quickly abolish the police, right? I think, in a sense, that there's a really good and important policy position lurking beneath that slogan. But that slogan was a gift to the right wing. And so if we are in favor of very aggressive state and community-based regulation of the economy in order to break up centralized power, in order to create good jobs, in order to redistribute income and wealth, I think we say all of that and then we just leave out. And some people might call this socialism. Having said that, I think there are real issues about what we mean by socialism as well. And I think I'm not just being clever with my terminology. I actually think there are things that markets do that are really important. Not just in terms of innovation, but also in terms of information and the decentralization of economic power when competition is regulated, when accumulation is bounded. And so, yes, I think it sounds like we're on the same page. With your permission, I'll get back into the slides because I'm still
sorry for the interruption.
No, Wilma, please. And everyone, I think, I really welcome your comments. I want to be in dialogue with you. I just also want to try to finish the review of last week's lecture in time to have a little bit of time for this week's. So the next, I think, piece of background here is that in addition to becoming much more unequal in terms of income, we have become incredibly unequal in terms of wealth. And I showed you the diagram last week that has a map of the United States with wealth represented geographically on it, that the top 1% control about 40% of the wealth in the United States, that the top 10% control approaching 80% of the wealth in the United States. The bottom 50% have about 1% of the wealth in the United States. And this got quite a bit worse quite recently. And I think we have to recognize that our contemporary politics is still animated by the after effects of the Great Recession of 2008. And what the Great Recession did was ultimately to undermine the wealth of the bottom 90% of Americans, and the less wealth you have, the worse off you've become in the last 15 years. Now, I do want to point out that this diagram is a pre-COVID diagram. This is from the very end of the last decade, and that some of what our COVID-related legislation did was make this a little bit better. But in general, I think this helps us to see how indifferent the federal government was to the skewed effects on wealth of the after effects of the Great Recession. So I tried to, a couple weeks ago, take you into some of the academic literature on this. And then last week, I really highlighted Katerina Pastor's The Code of Capital and the idea that we have publicly enforced a private law regime in which lawyers have used contract law and trust law and property law, bankruptcy law, to create, in a sense, a distinct class of assets that plays by different rules from other assets, that is essentially protected from loss, but allowed to function as investment capital and reap great gains. And we'll get into this a little bit more today, but one of the questions here is this primarily an economic phenomenon, the growth of inequality, or is it actually primarily a political and legal phenomenon? And Pastor comes down strongly on the side of legal. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, whose work I've discussed with you before, come down on the side that this is really political, that the changes to the law in the 1980s through the 2010s really remade the tax structure, the ability of workers to unionize, the benefits and safety nets that go to workers and the unemployed, all of which was to the advantage of the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.01%, and to the disadvantage of the rest of us. This is not just a naturally occurring economic skew. This is a politically engineered, legally reinforced, deliberate move in the direction of a less just, less fair, less equal economy. So one quick sign of what this looks like, and I'm going to spend more time, these diagrams come from Robert Putnam, a little bit more time with Putnam today, as in a sense, I think the most robust and penetrating defender of the New Deal. One of the things that Putnam points to is the tax rate, just as a really simple X-ray into what equality promoting and inequality promoting policy looks like. We move from no federal income tax to a very regressive federal income tax. The diagram here, to unpack it for a second, shows the ratio between the top and the average income tax rate. And what you see is, right, as it goes up, that means that the ratio is getting more egalitarian, the rich are being asked to pay more. As it goes down, it's becoming more regressive, the rich are paying essentially the same thing that the middle or the poor pay. And so we went from having a regressive to a progressive to a regressive income tax. Corporate income tax, as it goes up, right, you on the one hand take some of the concentrated wealth out of the hands of corporations, hopefully making them a little bit less capable of dominating our politics and our economy. And on the other hand, right, you create more resources for taxes for your government to use to support everyone else. And again, we started with no corporate income tax. The corporate income tax gradually went up from around 10% to a high watermark of over 50%, and has come back down to the low 30s, high 20s, depending on which tax rate we're talking about. Now, I want to emphasize that there are other aspects to our current context, right? Not only the economic, but also the social and the cultural, that to put it in simple terms, at the same time that these economic transformations were occurring, we also became a much more multiracial and a much more multicultural society. We had our first Black president. We have had a growing number of elite and very wealthy individuals come from diverse social backgrounds. And at the same time, we have seen a decline of a traditional Protestant religious consensus in this country, and a growth of people who are less traditional or who come from other cultures. And I want to suggest to you that in and of itself, those trends would have provoked a certain amount of backlash. We see that, for instance, in Norway, a much more egalitarian society, as it undergoes aspects of these changes. But that when you mix rapid and profoundly threatening increases in inequality, undermining of economic security in with increased racial diversity, increased cultural diversity, you get a particularly toxic stew in which many people who are perhaps most threatened really by the economic undermining of their security are led to blame not the economic forces, but the racial forces and the cultural forces for what's happened to them. And that opens the door for a kind of reactionary populism, as we've seen in many countries. So in our country, right, that development has mainly been channeled into, cultivated, and exploited by the Republican Party, which has turned mainly into a party of anti-establishment mistrust, alienation, and grievance. It attacks the mainstream media. It attacked under COVID mainstream science. The same thing with regards to the greenhouse effect. And it has become a vehicle for a kind of hatred of and blaming of, on the one hand, cultural elites, call them liberals, and on the other hand, racial minorities, call them Black or call them immigrants. And so when we then drill down on how we got here, I've introduced, I think you're all familiar with at this point, the idea of a neoliberal economic era, a return to the kind of economic policy that was popular in the 19th and early 20th century, which suggests in order for a market economy, a capitalist economy to function well, it needs to be at most minimally regulated, that the government should basically guarantee property rights and currency, enforce contracts, but otherwise let the market go where it will. And we have been, I think, bipartisan for most of the last 20 years in supporting this approach to economic policy, reducing taxation, reducing the progressivity of taxation, reducing regulation, and minimizing the role of the government in the economy. And the social consequences of this have been profound. The neoliberal economic revolution, of course, coincided with globalization, with deindustrialization in advanced economies, with the revolution in computer, digital, and information technology, with automation. All of this radically changed our economy. But because we were in the grips of a neoliberal economic philosophy, we did very little to try to decelerate, hit the brakes. Don't let this happen so quickly, or soften the blow. Don't let people become immediately precarious. Or, I think most importantly, to um, put in place policies that took all of these economic forces and tried to turn them to the best for our society, especially for the bottom 50%. And we look to the north, to Canada, we look to Germany, we look to Austria, we look to Norway. These are societies that have undergone many of the same economic transformations that we've undergone, but were not as tightly in the grips of a neoliberal economic philosophy, therefore had more proactive labor force management policies. And as a result, their workers are better off today than American workers are. Their economy is less unequal. There are fewer people feeling the sting of downward mobility in societies that have been more active in trying to balance and work with and cushion the economic transformations we've undergone. So, with all of that as background, I now want to return to Robert Putnam, who I know I've introduced to you several times before. As I've said, I think he has the most nuanced and persuasive defense, and I want to be careful here. My focus is really on the New Deal. That is not Putnam's exclusive focus. He's really focused on the middle of the 20th century. And part of what Putnam suggests is that the success of the middle of the 20th century was not just the success of the New Deal, it was the success of multiple and simultaneous transformations in what he sees as the four most important structural dimensions of an overall society. In the economy, we went from a more unequal to a more equal distribution of income and wealth. In politics, we went from a more competitive, partisan, winner take all kind of environment to a more cooperative, bipartisan, collaborative political environment. In society, right? This is what some people call the third order, right? It's neither politics nor economy, but what we do in our own voluntary or civic associations. We went from being a society with very little organization, with very little participation, and so with a lot of fragmentation and competition and little trust or understanding of each other, into being a society where we actually joined voluntary associations, got to know each other, worked together, and as a result came to understand each other better and build what Putnam calls social capital, trust, and a capacity for collaborating outside of a formal organization. In culture, right? And here he's looking at what is said in churches and synagogues from the pulpit. also what is printed in newspapers and books and essays, what's displayed on movie and television screens. He suggests at the beginning of the 20th century, we were individualistic, perhaps even narcissistic, with an emphasis on individuality, rights, and identity. And that in the middle of the 20th century, we became a very different society, culturally speaking, a much more concerned for each other's welfare and well-being, oriented toward not just our own gain, but each other. So this is sometimes put under the rubric of solidarity, with an emphasis on joint responsibilities and the common good. And then when he tells this story, right, these four domains moving from being what he calls I disvalues, right? The emphasis on the individual to being we values, emphasis on the coming together, community, and solidarity. He suggests, look, at the remarkable synchronization of the arc of those four dimensions of society, right? Whether we're talking about the economy, politics, society, or culture, they all move from I values to we values back to I values. So he calls this an I, we, I curve, right? And he suggests, and this is why I say I've got to be careful not to describe Putnam as being exclusively about the New Deal, that these four things went together. And in fact, each of them was internally multifaceted. What happened in the churches, what happened in the Lions Club or the Kiwanis or the Rotarian Society, what happened with unionization, what happened with the New Deal, you can't say one or the others of those caused everything else. Point to one as being the most important, the key crux independent variable. Instead, these things happened simultaneously. And as they happened, they made each other more likely and ultimately more robust, that they reinforced each other, right? And so that's one lesson I think to take from the middle of the 20th century, and really the long history going from the late 19th into the middle of the 20th century, is you can't do this by state power alone. There is no one magic lever to pull in which everything else will then come into alignment. As opposed to that, we need a multi-front battle. People need to be working in whatever domain they feel they can be most effective in order to change not just our politics and policy, not just our economy, but also our culture and our society. So now to just go into a few details, and I'm going to go very quickly through this because I do want to talk a little bit about the criticism of the New Deal as well. This is to show the effects in the economy, right? And again, these are ways of looking at ratios of how much income the wealthy are getting versus how much income the other people are getting. And as you go up, you're getting more equal. As you go down, you're getting more unequal. Similarly with the distribution of wealth. And Piketty adds something that I think is important, which is even though we've gone to nearly the level of inequality we had at the height of the Gilded Age, the outset of the Great Depression, we've actually created a bit more of a stable middle class in this country in terms of home ownership as a store of wealth. And so I think that's an important qualification here. But we can then look at the political dimension, right? And whether or not there was bipartisan collaboration in Congress, whether or not people felt, the other party, I may not vote for them, but they're decent guys. They're people we can work with and respect, or instead felt, no, they're the enemy, right? I've shown you data recently that many people view people from the other party as less than fully human. in the 2020s, right? And so again, a movement there. Again, bipartisan behavior on the part of the electorate, ticket splitting, voting for people from both parties, right, became very popular in the middle of the 20th century, declined precipitously in the last 30, 40 years. And then do you approve of the president you didn't vote for, the president from the other party? And what you can see is, again, in the middle of the 20th century, presidential approval from the other party was reasonably high, right? And as we get into the Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump era, no, we just don't like them. No matter what they do, we're not willing to give them a chance because they're not from our party. And so we've gone into an era of political competition and contempt, right? Where we really don't like the other side. We're not willing to work with them. In fact, the willingness to work with them is a betrayal of your partisan identity, more likely to lead you to being challenged in a primary next time there's a vote. If we then notice what this does to attitudes about governance, I shared this with you last week, right? Declining trust in government. And that's really remarkable, from the right around 3/4 of the American populace saying they trust the government to less than a quarter. Similarly, the sense that the government doesn't serve the interests of most people, but just a few big interests, right, gone way up over the last 40 years. And then we transition quickly to society. One of the things Putnam really made his name doing was studying civil society, voluntary associations, organizations that you join because you want to be brought into contact with other people, to do things on a volunteer basis together. And what we see here, right, is that actually there was a huge spike in the founding of membership organizations in the late 19th century, followed by a huge spike in joining those organizations through the middle of the 20th century. And this brings people together. It gets them acquainted with each other. As they get to know each other, it becomes harder to demonize people who come from different situations or have different beliefs from those you have. It also makes it more likely that you're going to identify common interests and ideas and ability to work together and ultimately come to trust each other. By the way, right, this is the period of rapid increase in union membership. We get to the point where basically 1 in 3 private sector unions, I'm sorry, workers in the United States are members of unions, where there's a lot of mention, and in a positive context, of the idea of unions. It used to be thought that unions were the organization that stood up for the working man, for the little guy, that created a level playing field, or at least addressed the degree of inequality in wage negotiations. And then that's gone down precipitously. Rise and fall of marriage. And I'm smiling because I'm thinking of the David Brooks essay from a few years ago from The Atlantic. The nuclear family was a mistake, right? And it's worthwhile noting that for much of this period, in the late 19th, early 20th century, we're still living in larger kinship unit families, many of us. The middle of the 20th century, we have a rise in marriage, but an experiment with the idea that the couple and their children live on their own in their own freestanding home, maybe in an entirely different city from their parents and siblings. And that seems not to have worked very well. And among the consequences is a precipitous decline in the marriage rate. Many of us are simply not getting married, getting divorced, having children out of wedlock. And for Putnam, this is a sign that we are no longer as tightly integrated as a society. The family and the unions are central institutions of association. Among then the consequences, social trust has gone down precipitously. as has social solidarity, the sense that we're all in this together, that we have each other's backs, that we care for each other. And in particular, if you're born in the middle of the 20th century, you're very likely to say, I tend to trust other people implicitly until they show me that they can't be trusted. If you're born in the 1990s or up until the present, you're much less likely to trust strangers. And Putnam suggests that's not just a free floating idea, that's rooted in the fact that we have much less opportunity to get to know each other because there is much less participation in associational life. The final focus of Putnam's analysis here is on the idea of culture and community. And his gaze goes to what's being preached at churches, what's going on in newspapers and publications. And he suggests that we move from being a competitive to being a more cooperative, to again being a more competitive society if we look at these sources. Similarly, for references to the common man, right? Very uncommon in the beginning of the 19th century, very prevalent in the middle of the 20th century, and then again, much less circulation of that idea. Agreement, compromise, unity have all gone up and gone down in the popular vernacular. And what's replaced them in the late 20th, early 21st century, an emphasis on identity and individuality, replacing responsibility or rights as alternative ways of thinking about our relation to each other. And so to synthesize these results, Putnam suggests that if you look at American books and whether they speak in the first person singular or plural, right, as one way of thinking about whether we're thinking only about myself or about us collectively, we see a great deal of individualism replaced by communitarianism and then a return to individualism. Similarly, in the culture as a whole, community declines, rises, declines, right? And so again, the claim here is not simply that the government by itself changed the tone and tenor of American society, but that simultaneous developments in our politics, in our economics, in our society, in our culture, what Putnam refers to in somewhat technical political science speak as interbraided reciprocal causality, right? Not one thing, but the intersection of multiple developments, each of which is internally diverse and which have the effect of ultimately reinforcing each other, produced a much more cooperative, collaborative, solidaristic culture, society, politics, and economy in the middle of the 20th century. If we want to do this again, we can't simply try to pass policies. We have to do a lot more. And of course, we're going to do it, let us hope, without the benefit of the Great Depression and World Wars. We're going to do it in a more diverse and less traditional society and with a very different media system. But Putnam would be quick to point out the late 19th, early 20th centuries were not favorable to the developments that ultimately happened either. It took a great deal of work, a great deal of effort to get there. So now, just looking for a moment at what happens when we transition from a more cooperative to a more competitive society and economy, union membership, right? And I spoke earlier about the salience of the idea of unions. Now, just how much of the private workforce belongs to unions? 5% in the 1890s, fully a third in the 1950s and 1960s, down to 10% in the current decade. What happened to the minimum wage? Didn't exist until FDR put it in place. It then went up. These are constant dollars from $4 to $10 an hour from 1930 to 1970, but it's been driven back down close to $6 to $7 an hour now. No longer a living wage. And by the way, right, when we collect fewer taxes, we can do less with our government, right? And so we are not doing as well in terms of high school graduation. One of the critical things that Putnam emphasizes is that in the 20th century, one of the reasons the American economy was so robust, had such a competitive advantage, was because we had a good match between the educational and technical background of our labor force and the demands of the economy. Right as we were transitioning into an information-based computer digital technology economy, we took our foot off the gas with regards to education, and the result is that we don't have that advantage anymore. And last thing to look at what social disinvestment does to society, right? This is intergenerational economic mobility. It was higher in the 1940s than it is today. It went up all the way through the middle of the 1960s to the point where 90% of children were doing better than their parents, and it's dipped all the way down to 50%. Basically, it's a coin toss now whether your children will do better than you did in the coming generation, economically speaking. As you can see, deaths of despair, which we've already discussed, if we look at it in a longer perspective, went down from the early 20th century into the middle of the 20th century, and then have absolutely skyrocketed in the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. So this lets us see perhaps a little bit of some of the positive lessons we can take away from the New Deal and the success overall in constructing a more democratic political economy in the middle of the 20th century. We need simultaneous and reinforcing social, economic, cultural, political, and normative change. It can't be one silver bullet doing all of this for us. And we need to recognize that these simultaneous changes were carried by broadly based and diverse progressive movements. And so Wilma was emphasizing, right, World War II, the Great Depression, the Cold War as events that brought us together. I also said, let's not forget the progressives, let's not forget the populists, in part because, right, you need to channel the crisis constructively if you're going to build on it to bring people together. And the fact that there were hundreds or thousands of locally based, community-based organizations working on multiple fronts allowed people to have the ideas in place, the appropriate lenses, the forms of solidarity to bring about the interbraided reciprocal causation that Putnam refers to. Educational innovation and technological change, when they're coupled, right? When there's a rapid change in technology that affects the economy and your education system keeps up with it, you get greater equality. It actually does produce broad-based economic benefits. If they're decoupled, if the economy changes in terms of what workers need to know in order to compete, but the educational system does not keep up, then you get a rapid increase in inequality. So middle of the 20th century, last 30 years. The unions, right, I think were really important in making the structural change in the American economy such that our growth went much more broadly to workers. The labor share in the economy went up to around two thirds of the uh, growth and profit actually went to workers, and it's come back down. And it is also the case that there's a question about whether or not both employers and the overall political environment, the parties support or oppose unions. And I think again it's easy to lose track of, but in the middle of the 20th century and in places like Austria and Germany, in Europe today, many employers are in fact pro-union. They find unions to be useful partners in managing their businesses and also politically in getting support for good economic policy. Whereas when employers and major parties oppose unions, it gets much more difficult to sustain a union movement. I think we have to recognize that the union movement in the United States in the 20th century had both successes and blunders, that they overplayed their hand in the 1960s and 1970s and did contribute to inflation. But that doesn't mean that that's endemic to a union movement, and that hopefully 21st century unions could be smarter in their approach to economic policy and labor wage negotiations. Finally, and I think this is really important for the work on deaths of despair, unions were not just effective at representing their members' interests vis-a-vis employers, they also created a site for solidarity, for coming together, for social connection that made people feel that they belonged to something bigger than themselves, that they were contributing to their overall society's productivity. And with the remarkable decline in union membership, we've not only seen many more workers become more precarious, we've also seen them lose what Ann Case and Agus Deaton refer to as the very pillar of their existence, their sense of belonging to something important and integrating for them. Public economic policy, which is where I really want to focus, was obviously very important. Progressive taxation, spending in ways that produced both economic security and mobility, regulation, right, of the entire financial sector, the banking industry especially, in order to prevent speculation, to keep the economy from overheating, to break up concentrations of wealth and power. I think we lose track of this, but there was no major deep recession between the end of the 1930s and the 1970s as a result of good macroeconomic policy. And then finally, the minimum wage, when it is actually a living wage, actually something that contributes to economic viability for families, can be extremely important. So what are the main conclusions if we want to try to draw out the positive implications of this history for us that we should draw? First, that this is a long history, right? That this goes back to the 1870s, 80s, 90s. It's not just FDR comes galloping in and saves us. He is building on movements that have been around at least a half a century before he comes to power. And it's a long history in which no one development, one area is the key driver, as opposed to there being multiple simultaneous reinforcing movements that eventually coalesce into changing the culture as a whole. This was a success story. I think that the data that I've shown you is really important, and therefore it is worthy of emulating, right? That we became a more equal, more collaborative, more cooperative, more trusting society. That is something we should be aiming for again. And yet I want to suggest that we need to ask a really important critical question, and that's the final point on the slide here. Why did the New Deal eventually collapse? And here Putnam suggests that its collapse was more external than internal. It wasn't that it was unsustainable, it's that eventually the affluent got together and large corporations collaborated to undermine it. And that if there was a flaw in it, it's that we perhaps got a little bit too aggressive in supporting equality and supporting unions. We overshot, but that this was not an internally flawed project. And as you know from last week, I'm interested in a number of scholars who tell a different story about the New Deal. And I'm going to speak with you a fair bit in the coming week about K. Sabil Rahman, who is currently the number 2 in an organization called ORIRA, which is part of the federal government, the Office for Information and Regulatory Authority, and has been doing really important, very wonky work. But he's also a scholar, former head of the group Demos, and I really like his book, Democracy Against Domination. And then a couple very well-established scholars, Ira Katz-Nelson of Columbia, one of the most productive political scientists and historians writing today, and his book, Fear Itself. Let me just preview very quickly. Rahman suggests that the New Deal, though it succeeded in erecting a modern 20th century regulatory state, at the same time defamed and displaced the more radical elements of the progressive movement, tried to turn economic regulation essentially into a managed, expert-based enterprise of promoting economic growth, and that proved to be internally fragile and to open itself up to the neoliberal revolution. Ira Katz-Nelson in Fear Itself emphasizes the way in which the New Deal was a great deal for white male workers, but not so much for the rest of Americans. And therefore, when the civil rights movement, when the feminist movement, when the new social movements of the second half of the 20th century took hold, they did not align themselves, did not defend, did not see themselves as extending the New Deal so much as having to overcome the way in which the New Deal built on white male privilege. Finally, Daniel Rogers, in a pair of books about the history of the 20th century, Atlantic Crossings, which is really about the interchange of ideas between Europe and the United States on building a welfare state, and then The Age of Fracture, about the coming apart of the consensus that had maintained the New Deal, also holds that the New Deal, because it relied on expertise, because it was so bound up with the Cold War as well, could not sustain the level of solidarity and ultimately gave way to an age of fracture that opened the door for the neoliberal era. So I'm not going to be able to go into, I promise this is where we'll start next week, all of the details in terms of the criticism of the New Deal. But I just want to point out in particular that if we look at the administrative state, because this is where I really want to focus some of our attention, that we need to recognize that the New Deal, in a sense, relied on the degree of solidarity that it represented, and that we do not have that degree of solidarity. We have seen the resurgence of a much more competitive quote, greed is good kind of approach to capitalism in the 21st century. And so we need stronger countervailing forces than simply expert driven managerial administration. And so how do we make an administrative state for the 21st century, learning the lessons of the limit of the New Deal? That's where I want to go with you in the coming week. Why don't I stop there and open things up for discussion? I imagine you have thoughts or comments. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, go ahead. But remember, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Hear me now?
Yes, I can. That's good.
Just a bit of
Oh, go ahead.
our section, Piedmont Avenue, tells us a wonderful bit of history about the 1930s. We see some beautiful schools that were built, libraries that were built, and even some of the sidewalks that were built. You actually see the insignia, 1936, 1934. And it was a time that when people were building schools, Kaiser Hospital became known and identified as a way to take care of people. Of course, it was accused of socialism, but we lived with it. I just mention it as a time that I lived in and grew up in and took for granted.
And Flossie, I think a lot of what you're talking about are actually public works projects under the New Deal, right? And so let us remember that the Great Depression, with its rampant unemployment, gave rise to the alphabet soup efforts to bring people into the workforce by giving them public employment. This led to public works projects, whether we're talking about electrification, dams being created, schools being built. It's one of the reasons I put the Diego Rivera mural at the beginning. That's a public works project, right? And let's go all the way forward into building the interstate highway system, or the moon shoot, right? The Apollo project and all of the technological spin-offs that came out of that. We had for a very long time a very strong commitment to building out our public infrastructure. And of course, the crown jewel of all of this is the public education system, the schools from elementary through high school, through state-based college and university systems, right? This was all extremely important to our success in making ours a cooperative middle-class society in the middle of the 20th century. I'm looking into some of the really tall grass esoteric details of this. And so one of the regulatory state features, it's a so-called circular document, A94, which is a directive that all administrative state regulatory agencies are supposed to be in compliance with. And it sets what it calls a future discount rate on public investment. So if it provides a benefit today, that's worth $1. If it provides a benefit next year, well, discount the value of that benefit by 7%. If it's the year after that, discount it by 14%. The year after that, 21%, right? And so the outcome of this policy that is a policy that was adopted in the 1990s and has never been revised is basically that nothing that counts as public infrastructure would have been invested in if this policy had been in place in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, right? Because none of it pays for itself quick enough to justify the investment. And by the way, the Biden administration is revising this, and so it's funny. You, in a sense, you have to get into the tall grass to figure out how in the world did we do so well in the first half of the 20th century in investing in public infrastructure, and have we so completely reversed our course? And so yes, Flossie, I like the idea. Whether it's the electrical grid that we're all relying on right now, or the fact that we, if we're not in Flint, Michigan, just open our tap and assume that we can drink the water, et cetera, and so on, right? We rely on the infrastructure that we built in the 20th century and that we have been taking for granted, but not maintaining, repairing, let alone renewing and extending for future generations. Anyone else with a thought or a comment for today? All right, everyone. I know I got bogged down in talking about the political history of the New Deal in the middle of the 20th century again. There's a lot there, but I promise you we're into the 21st century, and the lessons that we can take from the New Deal, especially from the criticism of the New Deal, and from understanding some of the proposals to do this again, and the kind of catchy, kind of awkward phrase that's used here is a renew deal, right, for the next lecture. Talk to you next week. Take care. Look forward to it. Bye bye, everybody. Thank you.